Remember we had this talk about the master plan?
Yeah.
I knew when I was 10 years old that I wanted to be a psychiatrist. 10 years old, but when I was 20, when I finished college, I took work as a pimp. I had to.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey Joey, here's a riddle. What's a cartoon without cartoon characters? The answer is Dr. Katz, professional therapist.
We're delighted to talk with Mathew Klickstein, an author and pop culture historian whose books have covered such topics as Nickelodeon, The Simpsons, the San Diego Comic-Con, and Lloyd Kaufman, president and co-founder of Troma Entertainment. His recent article, SQUIGGLEVISION, 30 Years of Kvetching from the Couch of Dr. Katz, Professional Therapist, is available at Paste. Mathew, welcome back to Amusing Jews.
Thanks for having me on again, guys. I always love coming here.
What was your first exposure to Dr. Katz, Professional Therapist?
In the early days of Comedy Central and when it was still coming together as Ha and the Comedy Channel before they merged, I was watching a lot of that. And that was back when it was still just clips of Mr. Biddle.
Oh, hey, everybody, it's me, Mr. Bill. Hey!
And I think Monty Python might have been on it.
And now for something completely different.
I don't think there was any original programming quite yet. And there was something called
Short Tetris Band Theater with shorter host Mark Maron, weeknights at 6, only at Comedy Central.
And part of that was these little clips of different shows and cartoons. And one of them was early Dr. Katz. And something about it just really struck me. It was, in a lot of ways, proto South Park. I was coming, in some ways, a little less sophisticated version of Bill Plimpton. Something that people like Don Hertzfeld would be doing years later, where the animation was amateurish is almost the wrong word to say, because it still felt sophisticated in the way that Bill Plimpton's work can, where it's sketchy, but you can tell that the people doing it really know what they're doing. It's kind of like when you watch or look at certain abstract or even Dada art, somebody like Cy Twombly or Dubuffet or even Andy Warhol. Even as a kid, I think I just connected with it on that visceral primal level of, this looks very different. This looks very sloppy and silly and amateurish, but I felt safe with it, and that the people doing it knew what they were doing and they weren't just being lazy or intentionally stupid or unintentionally stupid. And I think that's what really struck me more than even the comic was the way it looked. That's why I called the article SQUIGGLEVISION, which is the software that Tom Snyder, who created the show with Jonathan Katz, that was the proprietary software that made it look the way that it did. And it evolved over time, especially when it became the actual series, Dr. Katz, Professional Therapist. But even that, as we all know, that does have that kind of South Park kind of throwaway, primal sketch artist kind of look that even Lauren Bouchard, who started on the show and would later create Bob's Burgers, utilized with other shows like Home Movies, for example, that he co-created.
Yeah, there's something very artistic about the way that they use their inexpensive means to create the cartoon. It's pretty apparent when you compare it to the old infamous shitty cartoons of Sam Singer.
I'm not familiar.
Yeah, look it up. It's like the worst cartoons ever made.
But I sure hope we don't land on those rocks over there. They're coming up mighty fast. And they're, look out now. They're getting too close for comfort, I tell you. It's dangerous. Here we go, Buster. I'm afraid this is going to be it. We can't possibly clear those rocks. Oh!
But again, like with Dr. Katz, myself as well, I think the first time I saw it was in college. There was a big screen TV in the lounge at the dorm I was living in, and there was a marathon of Dr. Katz. And I think I was actually hypnotized by the SQUIGGLEVISION. Like, I couldn't get out of my chair. I just sat there for hours and hours and hours. There was something incredibly compelling. It didn't even matter, like you said, if it was funny or not, or if the jokes were landing or not. It was actually like tricking my brain into watching this thing for much longer than I should have.
I mean, I don't really remember my first impressions. I think I saw it when I was very young because, I mean, Comedy Central was a pretty big mainstay on our cable watching habits. So I think I saw it probably when I was very young and before I got any of the jokes. Then again, I was just rewatching it and sort of binging on it. And as like a lover of stand-up comedy, especially from that era, like I remember Dom Herrera and I remember these old stand-ups.
Guess you meet a lot of wackos, huh? Do you think my busts are too big for a man's? Does my face look bulbous?
And it felt like the two things were very separate. There was comedians doing kind of shtick, and it wasn't in your face, but it was like kind of intelligent in this way that was sort of understated.
About binging it as well, it's unfortunate that it's not on any of the streaming services because I think it would be one of those refreshing, bingey, retreats from everyday life.
You really can't even see it very well on YouTube. I have friends, as we all do, I'm sure, who could get bootleg copies of it. You can buy some of the DVD seasons. I don't think all of them. And the problem is that the rights are locked up, not necessarily with Comedy Central, but there's some executive producer who somehow ended up getting it through some contractual dealing. And for whatever reason, he's just holding it and isn't letting it go. And it's been very disappointing to Jonathan, to Tom Snyder, to Lauren, to some of the people involved with the show, because you guys are right. I mean, look, the new King of the Hill's out now, and there's talk about doing The Critic again, and all these other shows, Beavis and Butthead, even live action shows obviously have been getting rebooted. I mean, this would be the time to come out with Dr. Katz again. We've even talked about, or they've talked about, how they would do it, and and they've done different versions of it in more recent years, like the podcasts, the live shows that they've done. And they've gotten new comedy people or even actors like John Hamm, and they've gotten Amy Poehler and, people like that. So there's definitely a viability to bringing Dr. Katz back. It certainly is on a budget level would be pretty easy to do. But for whatever reason, there's this villainous executive producer who somehow has the rights and he's not letting it go. And that's just the way that it is.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
When Sigmund Freud was developing psychoanalysis, he was accused of dabbling in Jewish science. As it happens, Jews do seem to be disproportionately represented in therapy, both as therapists and as patients. Perhaps a show like Dr. Katz was inevitable?
I really wanted to push the fact that it's kvetching on the couch. The show is incredibly Jewish. As you guys know from my Jewish culture encyclopedia, one of the first entries I wanted to do was Dr. Katz in that book, both because I was friendly with Jonathan and I just, again, thought, hey, here's another way to sneak Dr. Katz into something that, other people maybe wouldn't have chosen to put it in, just because it isn't as well known or whatever. So no, I see Dr. Katz as a very Jewish show. And part of it is the kind of comedy it is and the kind of comedians he got, even people who were Gentiles, have a very Jewish inflection, a very Jewish style of their comedy, the observational humor, the self-denigrating humor, even a lot of the one-liners. I mean, for years, how many of us thought Mitch Hedberg was Jewish for multiple reasons, obviously?
Hi, my name is Mitch Hedberg. I'm coming in to see the doctor at 11 o'clock appointment.
I'm sorry, what?
I mumble a lot. Did you hear anything I just said?
I think that the comedy was very Jewish, maybe intentionally so. But also the therapy aspect is very Jewish. It's so built into our culture. As you guys know, I think at this point, I'm not a religious Jew. I'm not practicing, but I am intensely culturally Jewish, and always have been. My Jewish relationship growing up was George Burns, not necessarily Shabbat or going to synagogue, or even I never was bar mitzvahed even. But I was very connected to the Jewish culture because at a very young age, I was engaged with Marx Brothers and Three Stooges. That humor goes into the idea of questioning things, of analyzing things, overanalyzing things, the angst of it, the wandering, the exploring, the investigating deeply, the fact that for questions even, I mean, it's part of our rituals. It's part of our system of beliefs and concepts, even for someone like me who's not necessarily a quote unquote believer in that regard. And that's what Dr. Katz was. That's what Dr. Katz did. And that is what a lot of therapy is about. I think in some ways we were headed at a game there before there was, the popularization of the quote unquote talking cure, or people like Freud and Jung and, that the whole concept of analyzing and talking things out. And that's what a lot of what we do and who we are as Jewish people. And I'm very proud of that. And that's what connects me to the Jewish community without being a practicing Jew or even having been bar mitzvahed, is I'm constantly neurotically questioning myself, questioning other people, deconstructing and questioning society, mores, government, media, all different kinds of things. And that's what a lot of therapy is about. And I think it's a way almost of making it more healthy and making it more constructive and productive. It's like we have this almost superpower, this innate superpower. Hate to play into that Jewish trope, but this innate superpower of doing that already as part of who we are, as part of our blood, as part of our culture. For many people, as part of their religious stance and ideology and ontology. And here's a way of how can we take that over analyzing or deconstructing and using it as a health tool, as a wellness tool. And I think that's a lot of what Dr. Katz is about.
Dr. Katz wasn't created by its star, comedian Jonathan Katz, but by Tom Snyder, not to be confused with the late-night talk show host. How did the show come about?
Jonathan is a very humble guy. We remain very close friends. I love talking to him. It's great talking to Jonathan, by the way, because he, and this is one of the facets of the show that's so important. They literally had something in the booth that said no voices. I mean, everyone is themselves. So Jonathan really talks like that. So whenever I get a phone call from him, it's just wild, especially when we first were introduced to each other. Just Matthew, it's Jonathan Katz. How you doing? And we'd start talking, and he's got that almost Bob Ross, again, ASMR voice. And he's very dry humor. He's always delivering jokes. I almost feel pressed to keep up with him in one-liners and jokes, because just the way he talks. Sometimes it can almost seem like he's making fun of you in a way, and maybe he is, but in a lovable kind of avuncular way.
I apologize for trying to create an environment in which two adults can live.
Oh, what are you trying to say, that because I have a stuffed animal, I'm not adult?
I think you said it eloquently.
But that is how he talks and who he is and the way that he is. So I think part of that is that he's even agreed that he's given a lot of the credit to Tom Snyder, who, yes, is not the talk show host, but was a guy who was working on educational software in the very early days, and slowly but surely came to this process that he copyrighted, patented, that was called SQUIGGLEVISION. And they were doing different experiments and different work with it on other, animated projects that he was working on. Again, some of it was educational, some of it was early kind of gaming and that kind of thing. I mean, we're talking like Apple IIe days, Number Crunchers and Oregon Trail and that kind of thing. But he was a humor fan also. He was a fan of old style animation, cartoons like Looney Tunes and the like, and became a fan of Jonathan Katz. He saw him doing some of his folk music, comedy stuff that he did, because Jonathan is also a real musician and did folk music stuff, kind of like, Marshall Brickman and certain other people who started in that kind of realm of doing music and folk music, and was also doing comedy at the same time. And at the same time was being approached by people who were putting together what would ultimately become Comedy Central, to bring some material to them, because they saw and knew that he could do things on a very low budget with some of the software he was developing, and that it was his. And indeed, some of the very first elements of Dr. Katz were done more or less out of his house. They would set up the recording studio, I think in his pantry even, and just put up, some eggshells and whatnot to make it soundproof. And if I remember correctly, even maybe some of the earliest parts of the series were done that way. I could be wrong about that, but I know that there was an element of that. And then bring in Tom had been teaching before he got involved with educational software, and one of his young students was a young man named Lauren Bouchard, who actually dropped out of school and became a bartender. And they just happened to be in Boston at the same time and ran into each other, very beshert. And Tom said, hey, I'm putting together this new series, this new concept. Would you like to be involved? And Lauren said, sure, sounds like it beats bartending. And Tom brought Lauren on, and Lauren was a musician also and understood audio engineering and understood how to, work the boards and all that other good stuff, and worked with Tom on this show that was going to revolve around this guy that Tom found, Dr. Jonathan Katz. He was not a doctor. And everything else went from there.
Could you tell us more about SQUIGGLEVISION and how that got started?
Honestly, I'm not much of a technical person these days, so I don't know some of the nuances and specifics about how or why it works. I just do know that it was software that Tom Snyder developed for some of what he was working on and experiments that he was already doing, and then it just fit perfectly with the concept of the show in ways that we were kind of talking about earlier, in a show that was going to be a lot of talking, and that was going to be, basically stand-up comics who were going to be telling their stories. Some of the original versions and iterations of the show, from what I understand too, from Tom and Jonathan, was that they were going to maybe actually take it somewhat seriously. And Jonathan, it seems like he was even a little bit confused about whether he should actually be trying to be a therapist or not with some of these people. And they were just trying to kind of spitball and figure out what the show was going to be, until I think they came to the conclusion ultimately that, again, many of the stand-up comics that they were having on the show, their bits, were already basically custom-made anecdotes that could be told to a therapist. And that Jonathan could really be that Bob Newhart character in The Straight Man, the Jack Benny, of just kind of saying, yeah, right, what else? And just let these people essentially do their routines, do their bits.
Do you go to the movies?
No.
Do you play sports?
Maybe.
Do you go to the theater?
I went to the opera once.
Yeah.
I'm sitting at the opera and I'm thinking, look how much work it takes to bore me.
Do you think the show would have worked if it were live action?
Jonathan does live action versions of it as theater. I mean, he would actually be on stage, and it was Dr. Katz. And evidently it did quite well. So we actually do have a case study of them doing it live, and evidently it worked. But I'm glad that it was animated, because that's part of what makes it so special, and not just another Cheers, or not just even another South Park, which would come later, obviously. It has its own aesthetic, its own world, its own universe. That, I think, would have been difficult to do live action. But the actual humor and the back and forth and the compelling engagement of it, just from the humor and dialogue, I think would have worked live action. And as I just said, indeed has as a live action show that Jonathan Katz would do.
Dr. Katz was a showcase for stand-up comedians to tell their jokes, with Jonathan Katz playing the straight man. These were mostly improvised sessions. How did they go about editing down the audio for the episodes?
Lauren Bouchard is obviously something of a genius. Here's a guy who didn't even graduate high school. He dropped out when became a bartender, and in some ways cosmically got involved with this show just by running into an old teacher of his out on the street in Boston, and is having to work with all this new technology and this whole new way of approaching animation that was literally new. I mean, he was working with the guy who developed the software that allowed it to happen. And from what Lauren told me, it really was like cutting together documentary or cutting together an album. When Rodney Dangerfield was on the show, he had no idea what was going on, from what I understand. And some of what he said that ended up in the show was him actually kind of talking with some of the people in the booth.
And Dr. Katz, would your feelings be hurt if I left early today?
Rodney, this is not about my feelings, so I guess I would have to ask you, what time were you thinking of leaving?
Now.
Well, that hurts a little.
All
Why
right.
don't you at least sit down for a second?
Okay, we're done, huh?
And they cut it together in such a way that he just seemed like another character, quote unquote, on Dr. Katz. So, it really is taking all that material, field sounds, if you will, the way that like somebody even back in the day, like oral historians like Alan Lomax or Studs Terkel would just take material from interviews or talking with people or just, putting the microphone out there and then just cutting it together later and making a book or making a documentary or making a vinyl of those sounds. And that's how they approached it. So it was a lot like jazz or a lot like oral history material in interviews and documentaries. I think that's why it comes off as so real and so authentic. And somebody maybe would just say something that wasn't even part of their bit or routine. Maybe they were talking to the booth, but hey, let's cut that in because it's funny and it works.
Do you have a favorite guest or segment from the show's 6 seasons?
Yes. I always used to love, even as a kid, I love when Dave Attell would be on.
I need to drink to stop the voice in my head. And the voice in my head has a stutter. And that is very annoying. Kill your what? Kill your write it down!
Something about his voice just worked so well with that show. I think I'm not alone there. And I think even Jonathan really appreciated Dave's. Like, his voice just worked so well for the show. And his humor, the stories that he would tell worked so well. Like, he would tell these just absurdist, but very based in reality anecdotes. I mean, that's so much of what his stand-up comedy is.
What's the legacy of Dr. Katz in the worlds of comedy and animation?
I mean, in a word, talent. I mean, just some of the names that we've been talking about here. It's incredible that Jonathan was a mentor to and friends with and collaborators with oftentimes very young comedians who wouldn't do anything in the bigger, more mainstream way for years later. And whether you could argue the show helped out their careers, you could argue that maybe they would have had the careers they had anyway, but it certainly was a platform, whether it was for bringing people like Joan Rivers and Rodney Dangerfield and even Gary Shamling. Well, Shamling was still pretty big at the time. But just people from, more of a more classic era of stand-up comedy to a new generation, or, the big one, bringing these young comics like Dave Chappelle, and we were just talking about Dave Attell, even Mitch Hedberg, Sarah Silverman, to a larger platform than they would have had before. Mark Maron, Jon Stewart, the list goes on. He ultimately ended up having 80 different featured guests, and almost all of them either were or became, some of the biggest comedy people, many of whom still are to this day. And, they would say the same thing, that this was probably their first real big break outside of just the comedy circuit. In addition to that, though, I think that it legitimized and popularized and mainstreamed in some way the whole concept of stand-up comedy, that it could be a cartoon show, that it could be a series. You had people like Ray Romano, and you had people like Tim Allen, and you had people who were stand-up comics, even going back to Freddie Prinze with Chico the Man, and others who went on to do, sitcoms after they were doing their stand-up comedy work. But those were sitcoms. And they were scripted, and, they weren't exactly doing, until Seinfeld years later, and even that's just in the beginning and the end, their acts. This was a show that was solely their acts. It was solely their routines. The whole show was almost entirely just stand-up comedy people doing their acts, but it created a show. It created a story. And I think that it showed people, hey, stand-up comedy is more than just something that's at a club. It can be put out in this bigger way. It could be mainstream in this way.
Thank you so much for joining us again, Matthew.
Thank you.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.